Welcome to the Mass TLC security community, How Secure is Open Source Software. Ben Fischer, Principal Product Marketing Manager for Red Hat, is going to take us through a product manager's view behind the code. Before we go to Ben, I'd like to thank our security community sponsors, Devo, Nuance, PwC, and Vectra, and our global sponsors for all they do to support us throughout the year.
My name is Ben Fischer, and today I'm going to talk about how secure open source software is. As a former product manager, I'm going to give you a product manager's view behind the code. So first off, who am I? So quick little history of my career. I started off in product management and moved into product marketing and eventually into emerging tech marketing. And my history has always been with more closed source security vendors, and until recently where I've joined a couple years ago the Red Hat team, looking at security, risk, and networking technologies for them. And I'll give you my perspective on everything. So first off, what is open source software? There's a lot of misconceptions about open source software, and I'm sure if you ask 10 people, you get 10 opinions. But simply, open source software is a particular type of licensing that provides the software to be free. The source code is free and available for use to any end users. And because of this licensing, the open source software is available at no additional charge, or there's no cost to access that. And also with the licensing, it allows anyone access to the software, but also access to make any changes they want to the software and to submit them to be considered to be integrated into the overall source code. And that is really powerful because that can allow the source code to grow and allows the number of people to contribute to grow. And so it builds up into a large group of people referred to as kind of the open source community. And the other quick note is open source sometimes has an acronym of OSS. It also is sometimes called FOSS or FOSS, which is the free open source software. So now if we have this rough understanding of what open source software is, we should understand its alternate. So that's closed source software. And closed source software is really kind of the opposite in a way. The source code is not available for the public generally. It's not open to be looked at or modified in any way and not available for any type of distribution. It's generally referred to as proprietary software because it is legally owned by a particular corporation or entity. But a key note here is 99% of all code bases, which includes closed source code bases that were audited in 2019, include open source components. So kind of the first myth is closed source is not necessarily all proprietary code. It's delivered proprietary, but it includes open source software. And so if you don't have the open source component, a lot of closed software just wouldn't be possible. It's actually a huge enabler for the entire software ecosystem. So I want to just take a step sideways for a moment, just kind of think about kind of a profile of these two different software approaches, both open source and closed source, and try to understand kind of how each one approaches software development. So in open source software, obviously there's a software community, as I mentioned, and it attracts people who are very passionate, who have an interest in that particular software project. Some people do get paid to contribute to open source, but a lot of people get into it and do it because they enjoy it. And a lot of those people end up getting jobs because they enjoy it and they're doing good and they're contributing. Companies find value in what the work they're doing, and they want them to be part of their organization. And so the incentive and drive for them is very different. People also love that community atmosphere because it's kind of they're kind of a group of people they enjoy working with on particular technology, and they work with them generally for years and years. And that's furthered by the fact that one of the tenets in open source is peer review. It's just because software is open source doesn't mean that everything that everybody submits is going to be integrated into that software and rolled out. It does get peer reviewed for everything from, hey, does this make sense? Is it going to be performant in the software? Is it going to be secure? Is there any issues with it or concerns? Anything like that. It can really be anything. And so the power of the peer review is having more eyes on everybody's contribution means that there's more minds coming around and thinking about, is this the right thing for the software, both directionally, but also, like I said, from a security perspective. The longevity of it is really maintained by interest. So if people like Linux are passionate about Linux, it's going to keep going as a community very strong for a very long time. If somebody has a pet project and they work on something over the weekend and they submit it and they never come back to it because they moved on and they're not interested, then of course that software will not have very much longevity. Security fixes are not necessarily predictable. If there's organizations that are involved in open source, they can of course intercede, and they'll put people on the effort to fix and remediate any software fixes, security fixes that need to be made. If it's pure open source, then it's really up to whoever's in the community. So a large community never has those problems, but small communities can have those issues. And also the other key thing to understand here is contributors will work on what they're interested in, or the portions of that software that they're interested in, not necessarily what you're interested in. That is not to say that you can't contribute. I mean, anybody can contribute. So it just means that you can't trust that the open source community will do what you want to do unless you are either paying for somebody to support you and prioritize those feature requests that you have, or you have staff that is engaged in those open source projects to help facilitate the development that you want. Now closed source is, you kind of think of it as like a walled garden. Closed source organizations are hiring people, they're paying people per paycheck to go and do what is prioritized, by the company. The company's doing all this work to create a profitable enterprise, and they're focused on customer needs. So by focusing on customer needs, the customers are willing to pay them, and they're willing to go and contribute and develop that software and maintain that software and add features and fixes and patches to keep that software moving into life. So, and that's really where it's at. The only risk there is if the software becomes goes into decline because they lose customers, especially if the technology is getting old, then the business can become less profitable. They may have less people working on maintaining and developing the software, and if you need something else, that software starts to become kind of a dead platform. It's kind of like open source. There's both reasons why the software might flourish and move very fast in terms of development, and then there's times where it might be sunsetting. So in terms of doing a comparison of the two, and this is a very simplistic view, there's obviously a lot to debate in each one of these categories, but simply put, open source software is available at no additional cost. So if you want to go as an organization or an individual, go find some open source software, you can download it, you can compile it, run it, and do whatever you'd like with that. And there's no cost other than your time and the hardware that you might have need to run that equipment, that software. Closed source, you're paying for the software up front. Now, because of different transparency, open source is very transparent software. It has the benefit of being auditable, where closed source, you don't. All you know is you have a vendor who gave you software, and if you have any questions, you have to go to them and ask the questions, and you have to hope that they may give you any answers that you might need by your auditing team. And in terms of being modifiable, open source, obviously you can modify it. So if there's something particular you need for your unique environment, you don't have to rely on a closed source vendor. Closed source vendors generally do things that meet the customer's needs, but they may not do it for a single customer unless that single customer is willing to pay a lot of money or pay for dedicated engineering work. So that can be expensive, but the alternative is you can have open source software and you can have your own developers do that, or you can hire contractors also to do the work. Anybody really, because it all goes open source and then it's available for you or anybody who finds that work valuable. Bug reporting kind of varies. It's generally pretty fast for both. Obviously, it depends on the size of the project and the individual vendor, but generally it's pretty fast. Open source, the bigger the project is, literally the faster it tends to go, and the more reliable it is, because you're getting so many people who generally will have an interest in fixing those bugs, and also making sure that any fixes are thoroughly vetted and peer reviewed. Where in a closed source, you will have the vetting, you have the peer review, but it will be a smaller team with a more focused mindset on getting that software out. So it's not a good or bad thing, it's just a different approaches again. Security is kind of a really tough one here. For security, they're both generally quite secure. It does depend a little bit on the age of the software. It depends a little bit on the team, on individual policies, on the number of people who are contributing. There's obviously some differences there. But if you were to look at like large open source projects, for example, they're pretty solid. And these days, open source is getting more and more secure as there's more effort up front to make sure that security is designed and built in, and it's considered, bug reporting is considered at very early stages these days in most projects, because they know that it's really important for the life of the product. And there's a lot more companies that are buying into the open source world in terms of having their software open source and contributing to it. And for closed source, it also kind of depends too, right? If you have the size, you have a lot of the same types of questions. It's just a different beast. And security features, it's also very similar in security features and updates, and because we're talking about, you can, of course, for closed source vendor, you can go and ask them for a feature request. You can talk to your contacts there, and you can have those feature requests escalated. It's a system that tends to work. It tends to work best when you have a feature request that is of interest and value to lots of other customers. It tends not to work when you have a feature request that is very specific to your organization's needs and does not necessarily help any of the other customers, not necessarily those in the industry, it's the other customers of this particular closed source vendor. And in open source, that's kind of the value. There's a lot of open source projects that are very popular within certain verticals. And part of it is as one organization will step in and start contributing into the open source world, they realize that a lot of their peers will find value in it. And by their peers coming and contributing as well, not only do they kind of get the work that was already done, but they also realize that they can contribute as well, and the whole industry can move forward much faster. So there's a lot of really positive collaboration in the vertical space, and so that's a really important piece. Obviously, the only way you're going to get a closed source software without cost is if you get a trial, or you have a limited number of users. So there's like a free license option to use that software within under certain conditions that with certain restrictions. Generally, both are supportable. Open source isn't, unless there is an organization that particularly supports a particular source code that you are interested in. and you are interested in having that organization, you trust that organization to provide that level of support. Closed source, you have really no options other than the company who makes the software to provide the support for it. Stepping back, it's really kind of also, you need to think about kind of what are your needs and who do you trust. And what I mean by this is, instead of trying to make this a, do I buy open source or closed source, it can vary by the particular need you have. It can vary depending upon what your organization, what stage your organization's in. So I like to kind of, this is the moment of self-reflection, I think, where you step back and you reflect on your organization, say, what are your organization's strategic goals? And you kind of think about what are the expectations from your organization from a software vendor. Are you expecting, what type of support are you expecting? Is it 7x24? Is it, you want a certain response on feature requests? You want to know that they're going to prioritize your feature, even if it is only of value to your organization. What types of communications do they provide? Do they provide all the support you need for your audits? How often do they provide updates to software? Things like that. And one step further, it's also important to kind of consider the future. So also think about what needs are going to change. How are your needs going to change going forward? It's really valuable to go and say, here's what we need now. And then you go through a multi-month process of selecting software and evaluating software, and then you purchase it, and then you spend a couple more months maybe implementing it into your organization the way you like it. And then, half a year's gone by, maybe now starting to see that you need something different. There's so much expense in the time involved in going through the selection, purchasing, and deployment. Obviously, that time frame is quickly shrinking, but it's important to really think about how things are changing in the organization, how things are changing in the industry, so you have that future view. And there is quite a lot. Also, the other way to think about this is think about the experiences in the past and what's worked really well, but also reflect on what types of challenges you've had with vendors. And again, this is not do we buy closed sources or open source. This is, you can consider that as a general strategy, but it also might be very particularly by a certain group. It might vary by a particular need that you're looking at in terms of software. And the other thing to kind of lastly think about is if your organization has any open source community contributors. And the reason here is if you have contributors who understand how to do upstream communication and how to engage in those communities and how to contribute, it just makes it a lot easier if you are looking at going into the open source world. Even if you're not, it also provides you, I think, a lot of power and understanding and how these worlds work. So even if you're necessarily you're negotiating with your closed source vendor over something, understanding what the alternates are, let's say in the open source world, can be quite powerful as well. Now, the other approach I'd like to think about is kind of think about what type of buyer are you? On the left, I have closed source. On the right, I have open source. So, and from a closed source perspective, if you trust that vendor, if you get all the answers that you want about the software from support, any questions you might have for audit, and you get all those that you want from your closed source vendor, then it kind of becomes a matter of, okay, are they providing the features and updates that you want? Are they at a cost that you can consider and you're comfortable with as an organization? And are you getting kind of enough of the portability and security that you would expect that meets your organization's needs? If you are, then from a high level perspective, maybe closed source is a good general route for you for most of your options. If you are looking at stepping back and you really see the value of a large community that looks at software and does large peer reviews, if you like the fact that you have, the organization always has the ability to go in and make contributions to either maintain the software further, to add features, to make changes. If you appreciate the fact that it can be lower cost, not always, but it basically comes down to paying for support if you want to do it, unless you're doing it your own internal support. That's really powerful. Open source can be definitely a route for you. Another big benefit of open source is because the source code is available and it's always there, you can, it's fully portable. You can change whatever hardware infrastructure you have. You can put it on the software on one cloud vendor and move it to another cloud vendor. You can really, you can port it anywhere you like. It's completely up to you at that point. And you can collaborate with vertical peers or with upstream organizations, open source organizations, however you like. And you can engage as much as you feel comfortable. And if you stop feeling comfortable or you lose staff or you whatever, and you don't have that comfort or your priorities or goals change, you can withdraw. It's kind of a volunteer effort, really, in a sense, right? In that you can kind of participate as much as you want to and you're comfortable with. And we can't really talk about anything without really talking about kind of the FUD, the fear, uncertainty, doubt. So some people fear that open source software is not secure, that it's not reliable, it's not supported, only for hobbyists, it's free, it's get what you pay for. Obviously, I feel that these things are really inaccurate. Open source can be far more secure than closed source because it gets audited. You have potentially way more people peer reviewing all the software, as I mentioned before. Great example, the best example is Linux. There's tens of thousands of people who are engaged in the community in a very actively engaged, full-time perspective, and are peer reviewing everything. And there's so many components there that you really need to have such a large size community to do that. It is very reliable in that you have really most of the internet's running on things like Linux. Some of the biggest infrastructure out there is really running on open source software. And it's purely because it is so reliable. And it's just so powerful with all the things that can be done and how much it can be quickly can be modified, updated to meet various needs as the internet has moved so fast in our lives. It's not a hobbyist thing. I mean, a long time ago, free open source software was viewed as kind of a hobbyist only, but we have major corporations, Red Hat being one, but you have also major corporations that are running on open source. All your big internet companies are heavily involved in open source software development, and they've found it to be highly valuable, and so they keep increasing their involvement in open source software. While the source code is free, somebody has to support it. Just like you would go to a closed source software developer and you would buy a support plan, you either need to invest in internal resources to support it internally, or if you want support, go out externally and pay for a vendor that provides that type of support. And here, open source software, the pay what you get is, I do believe this is a general saying in life, but this is something different where you need to understand it's not just money that's being spent, it's time and effort. And so all the time and effort from all the collective people in the community that have contributed is the value here. And it's not necessarily the dollars spent. As a company, you are looking at the dollars that come out of your pocket. And so I get it, but that cost, again, is the amount of money you spend on either internal support or you spend on hiring a vendor to do that. Closed source software has changed a lot in terms of its pricing model, so it has very different ideas on pricing these days. I wouldn't call it expensive. It just has different models, and that's fine. It doesn't have to say closed source. There's also some closed source vendors that they can and some have moved their software to being fully open source. Red Hat has done that with acquisitions. IBM's done that as well. Other companies do that occasionally. So just because something is closed source once doesn't mean it always has to be. And so those in the open source world really get excited about things like that. And closed source software is not all homegrown. Like I said earlier, 99% of all audited source code actually has open source components in it. And the other one that I also want to call the myth for closed source software is that it's unsupportable if the business ceases. So with closed source software, some people do worry that, hey, if the company goes under, goes bankrupt, disappears from the earth, then you're dead in the water in terms of not having access to that software. Not with large companies, but generally with some very small startups, organizations can create legal agreements so that software is held in escrow. That source code software is held in escrow. So if that company became insolvent and there was a need to access that software to do something that was mission critical for the business, that can be an option. I've personally been involved in those types of agreements. So it definitely is something that people don't think about, but is something that's actually very valuable and something to consider. So let's talk about what you can focus on. So I think I kind of already talked about thinking about your needs, what your organization's goals are. And so this is really important, just to think about what are the problems that the software solves, right? What are the constraints in your organization in terms of people power, in terms of budget, in terms of whatever, and also think about what's the best solution. Obviously, you want to think about what's the best solution, but you need to kind of step back a little bit and understand those higher level needs first. And I think people don't consider the word trust enough. So you can a lot of the needs can be right on the line between open source and closed source. So it's important to understand whether you trust an organization or not, and to build up a relationship of trust if you are to make a decision one way or the other in terms of whatever vendor you choose, and also work on maintaining that relationship. And the reason why I say it's important as a customer, since I come from a product management side, is the vendors are really happy to work with customers in most all types of roles. And if you have a good relationship with that customer, you're going to be able to get access to more information. You'll likely be treated a little bit better in terms of getting quicker answers, maybe better answers, and that can pay off when you really need it. It's kind of the payment in terms of non-money, right? You as a customer also want to make sure that whatever organization you are going to trust with the software, and it's very critical in the software that's critical to run your organization. You want to invest in that relationship like you would, in your personal life, right? You want to invest in making sure you have those strong ties. So if you have a particular business issue, if you have some kind of security incident or whatnot, that you can engage them quickly and get whatever you need from them in response quickly. Also stability, I think we kind of talked about that before. Obviously, you want to pick an organization that's going to be solvent for a long term, that has a mission that is in line with your goals, your mission. Obviously, support. There's obviously a lot of things to consider there. In terms of references, obviously, to me, this is part of building up trust. But obviously, there's a lot of online reputation sites. And talking with peers, especially within your same vertical, who might have similar use cases, is really important. And communications is always understated and how important that is. But lastly, contingencies. So the reason why I like to talk about contingencies is things always happen. Things that you would never expect or predict can and will happen. Coming from a security side, you just know something's going to happen. You just don't know what is, or when, or where. So it's important to make sure that you have as much flexibility as an organization in terms of the software, the vendor, the configuration, the technology, whatever it is, so that you have the flexibility in various ways in which you can react, right? And going back, understand the more you have that stronger relationship with whatever organization it is, and you have that good communication set up, again, it allows you to react to that contingencies better and understanding what your choices are as far as other comparable technologies or going from open source to closed source or vice versa is very empowering. And so those are things you need to make sure you're aware of and doing your due diligence to understand various alternatives so you have those contingencies. So going forward, what should you kind of consider the future? I don't have a crystal ball, but I will say that these relationships are going to become more important in the future, especially with how things are happening in the supply chain space, software supply chain space particularly. You're going to need to know a lot more about all the people that you do business with all the software vendors. Transparency in software is going to become more important, and that's going to be challenging on how the closed source developers will react. The big thing to watch for there that everybody's going to have to be implementing is SBOMs, or software bill of materials, which basically would be a document that would describe all the components and where they came from. So that's going to start providing a little more transparency and a little insight into what is in the software that I'm buying. Think of it as a food label, right? I want to have an idea of what's in the food I'm purchasing. And so that also gets into the third-party awareness and understanding that if something happened from security's perspective to one of these components, then you'd need to know about it, because you would want to make sure you understand what type of risk you might be exposed to if there is an incident, a third party within the supply chain. A good example of that would be something like SolarWinds, right? You need to pay attention to understanding what's happening in the supply chain, so you understand what happens and what you can do about it. Regulations, there's always going to be more regulations. In the future, there's always going to be more and more things to happen over time. So that's something we just can't avoid, kind of like taxes. So we've talked about kind of a lot of different concepts here. And so the last really parting thought is, to me, this comes down to a simple, oversimplified conversation about trust. And trust is really important. It's important to really not just take this as a very high level concept and skip on, but to really dig into this concept and understand, do you have trust with these people? Does your organization, does your staff have trust? Is there a good relationship there? How can you make that trust stronger? And then you think about all these different areas, from communications to security. And it's really important to step through and understand and have these conversations where you're really getting into some of these details. Obviously you need to take the high level picture, but at some point you need to drill down. And if you have that trust at the high level picture, where your business needs are being met and the basic things that are important to your organization are being met, then it's important to bring it down and get the technical staff involved and make sure that all the nitty-gritty details are also there. Your staff's getting all the things that they expect and what they want from support, what they want from communication, what they want from a reaction time for updates, that if they have questions on certain software, that they're going to get it in the time that they need it, etc. I don't want to hit this too hard, but it is just really, really imperative to really think about this and dig into this and develop that, because to me, this is really the biggest question. It's who do you trust the most? If it's an open source vendor or closed source vendor, or which open source vendor or which closed source vendor, because in the end, this becomes a big security issue in my perspective when something happens, because the biggest issue in security is basically unpatched vulnerabilities. And so you need to know, as an example, how a vendor prioritizes patching of vulnerabilities, how they communicate that, what they do, how they answer any questions related to this. You need to get into all those details to understand that, so you are empowered, so you can take the responsibility, own that risk, and minimize that risk for your own organization. And with that, I would like to just thank you for taking the time to come and listen to me for a little bit. If you have any questions, my social handles are up there and my email as well. So please reach out to me. Thank you. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
A huge thank you to Ben Fischer, Principal Product Marketing Manager for Red Hat. Once again, I'd like to thank our security community sponsors, Devo, Nuance, PwC, and Vectra, and the Mass TLC Global sponsor.